Eric Connors barely felt the pain anymore. The burning sky overhead was fractured by streaks of plasma fire, the twin suns of Gorith, 7, casting an eerie orange glow over the ruined battlefield. His armor was shattered, his rifle empty. Blood pooled beneath him, his own and that of the comrades who had fallen around him. The war had been raging for 3 years. Humanity's expansion into the Outer Rim had met resistance from the Carthari Dominion, a race of brutal, six-limbed warlords who saw humans as nothing more than upstart vermin in their galactic empire. The fighting had been relentless, merciless, and now, for Eric, it was over. He could hear the Carthari warriors approaching, their guttural growls carrying through the acrid air. He tried to move, to reach for the combat knife strapped to his thigh, but his body refused to obey. A shadow fell over him. This is it. But the killing blow never came. Instead, a different shadow leapt into the fray, moving too fast for Eric's dazed mind to process. Blades flashed, alien war cries rang out, and then silence. He felt strong hands gripping him, pulling him up, blinking through the haze of pain. He saw her. Talyra. Talyra was not human. She was Kethari, an offshoot of the Carthari species, but their sworn enemies. Where the Carthari were brutish and towering, their carapace-like exoskeletons built for sheer destruction, the Kethari were a race of warriors tempered by honor and discipline. And Talyra was among their finest. Her violet eyes studied him as she propped him against a ruined steel barricade. Her obsidian armor was smeared with the blood of fallen enemies, and the double-bladed weapon in her hand hummed with residual energy. "You still live, human." Her voice was deep but smooth, carrying an almost melodic quality beneath its firm resolve. Eric coughed, the taste of iron thick in his mouth. Not for long. Talyra tilted her head, considering him. She reached into her belt and pulled out a vial of iridescent liquid. "Drink this." He hesitated. "I did not just kill those Carthari to watch you die," she said impatiently. With little choice, he took the vial and drank. The liquid burned at first, then spread warmth through his limbs. His vision cleared, and the pain dulled to a manageable throb. Why save me?" he managed to ask. Talyra glanced at the bodies around them. "Because I needed to." She didn't elaborate. Footsteps echoed nearby. More Carthari. Talyra's grip tightened on her weapon. "We need to move." She hauled him up effortlessly, supporting his weight as they slipped into the shadows of the ruined outpost. They traveled through the war-torn landscape for hours, slipping past Carthari patrols and navigating the labyrinth of destroyed vehicles and fallen buildings. Talyra moved with an uncanny grace, her senses sharp, her instincts precise. Eric, still weak, struggled to keep up. At last, they reached a hidden cave near the outskirts of the battlefield. Inside, the remnants of an old Kethari stronghold provided shelter. Talyra started a small energy fire and turned to him. "You owe me a life debt, human." Eric frowned. "A what?" She sat, crossing her legs, her gaze steady. "Among my people, a warrior who saves another in battle is bound to them until the debt is repaid. I saved your life. Now, you must fight alongside me." He let out a dry chuckle. "Lady, I could barely stand 10 minutes ago." Her lips curled slightly, a hint of amusement, or perhaps challenge. "Then I will train you." Eric exhaled slowly. His war was supposed to be over. But looking at her, he realized he wasn't done fighting yet. And for the first time in a long time, he had something worth fighting for. The days that followed blurred into a cycle of exhaustion, pain, and relentless training. Talyra was as merciless an instructor as she was a warrior. She drove Eric beyond his limits, forcing his broken body to rebuild itself with movement, battle, and discipline. The alien elixir she had given him had accelerated his healing, but his muscles still burned from exertion, and his lungs ached from the thin atmosphere of Gorith, 7. "Again," she commanded, tossing him a Kethari blade, curved, single-edged, lighter than any human weapon but built for speed and precision. Eric barely caught it before Talyra lunged. He dodged, but too slowly. Her blade whistled through the air, stopping just short of his throat. "You're thinking too much," she said, stepping back. A warrior reacts. Instinct first, thought second. Eric wiped sweat from his brow, chest heaving. Maybe human instincts aren't as fast as Ketheri ones. Talyra's violet eyes narrowed. Then we will make them faster. For hours, they fought. The cave became a battleground, the dim blue glow of bioluminescent fungi casting eerie shadows as their weapons clashed. Eric improved quickly, quicker than he thought possible. He adapted to her fluid fighting style, learning the Ketheri way of reading an opponent's body language, sensing the shift in their weight before they struck. By the end of the week, he was no longer a burden. He was a warrior. On the 12th night, Eric awoke to the sound of shifting rock. Talyra was already on her feet, blades drawn. Something was outside. Eric grabbed his rifle, repaired as best as he could manage with scavenged parts, and crept toward the cave entrance. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the night. Carthari. Talyra tensed beside him. Scouts. Eric peered through the cracks in the rock. The Carthari warriors were massive, their armored exoskeletons reflecting the pale moonlight. They moved with a terrifying grace, sniffing the air, their clawed feet clicking against the stone. They're tracking us, he whispered. Talyra nodded. Then we kill them before they can report back? Eric tightened his grip on his weapon. He was ready. Talyra moved first. A shadow in the night, she leapt from the cave entrance, her twin blades flashing. The first Carthari barely had time to react before her strike severed its throat, a spray of dark ichor misting the air. The second Carthari roared in rage, turning just in time to see Eric's rifle muzzle flare. The plasma bolt struck it in the chest, sending it staggering back. It didn't die. With unnatural speed, the Carthari lunged, its four arms slashing through the air. Eric barely rolled out of the way before its claws tore through the stone where he had been standing. Talyra was already moving, spinning low, slicing through the creature's legs. It fell to its knees, screeching. Eric didn't hesitate. He drove his blade into its skull. Silence. The bodies lay still at their feet. Eric exhaled. That was too close. Talyra wiped her blade clean. We need to leave. If there are scouts, there's a warband nearby. Eric nodded. They had nowhere else to go, but staying meant death. And so, together, they vanished into the night. They moved fast, traveling under the cover of darkness. Gorith 7's landscape was a graveyard of war. Ruined outposts, shattered drop ships, and rusting mechs littered the barren plains. Every step was a reminder of the unrelenting war between their species. Eric kept his rifle close, scanning the shadows for movement. Talyra led the way, her every step silent, her senses attuned to the dangers around them. He had learned to trust her instincts without question. By dawn, they reached the edge of the wailing canyons, deep, jagged ravines carved into the planet's crust by ancient tectonic shifts. The howling winds screamed through the narrow passageways, giving the place its name. Talyra crouched low, studying the terrain. The warband will be close. Eric frowned. You sure? She nodded. Scouts don't travel alone. Their absence will be noticed. As if on cue, the distant hum of engines rumbled through the air. Eric's stomach tightened. He turned to see a dark shape on the horizon. 3, no, for Carthari war skiffs gliding across the wasteland, kicking up plumes of dust. They're hunting us, Eric muttered. Talyra's grip tightened on her blade. Then we make them regret it. They had no choice but to descend into the wailing canyons. The narrow pathways gave them some advantage. Carthari skiffs were too large to follow, forcing their pursuers to continue on foot. Eric crouched behind a jagged outcrop of rock, rifle steady. Talyra had positioned herself above, balancing effortlessly on a narrow ledge. Her double-bladed weapon gleamed in the dim light. Then, the first Carthari appeared. A towering brute, its chitinous armor reflecting the pale glow of the twin suns. It scanned the canyon with sharp, predator eyes. Behind it, 3 more emerged, their weapons drawn, claws twitching in anticipation. Eric's heart pounded. He met Talyra's gaze. She nodded once. The trap was sprung. Talyra struck first. She dropped from her ledge like a shadow, blades cutting deep into the lead warrior's exposed throat. A gurgling hiss escaped its mandibles before it collapsed. Eric fired. The plasma bolt struck the second Carthari center mass, sending it stumbling backward. He fired again, this time a headshot. It crumpled to the ground. The remaining two warriors roared in fury. One charged Eric, its four arms swinging in a blur. He barely dodged, rolling aside as claws tore through the rock where he had stood. He fired blindly, but the creature was too fast. Then Talyra was there. She drove her knee into the Carthari's back, forcing it off balance. Eric took his shot. The bolt struck its exposed chest. It fell, twitching, before going still. The last Carthari tried to flee. Talyra did not allow it. She moved like a wraith, closing the distance in a blink. A single slash of her blade, and the creature fell lifeless to the canyon floor. Silence returned. Eric let out a slow breath, wiping sweat from his brow. That's 4 down. Talyra's expression was unreadable. There will be more. She was right. The skiffs had stopped. More figures were disembarking. Dozens of them. Eric's pulse quickened. We need an escape plan. Talyra's eyes flicked toward the canyon's deeper passageways. Then we go where they cannot. Without another word, she led the way. They ran. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The wind died down, replaced by eerie silence. The walls of the canyon twisted inward, forming a labyrinth of rock formations. Eric's boots crunched against the dry earth as they navigated the maze-like terrain. You sure about this? Talyra glanced back at him. No. Eric groaned. Great. Behind them, the Carthari warband's voices echoed through the canyon, distorted by the twisting paths. They were still searching. But how long before they found the right way? Talyra suddenly stopped. Her eyes narrowed at the ground. What is it? Eric whispered. She pointed at the dust-covered rock beneath them. This path has not been walked in centuries. A strange feeling crept into Eric's gut. Meaning? Talyra didn't answer. She simply kept moving, more cautiously now. The canyon opened into a vast underground chamber. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls, casting an eerie blue glow. In the center of the cavern stood something neither of them expected. A structure. Ancient. Massive. Alien. Eric exhaled. What the hell is this place? Talyra's violet eyes flickered with something he hadn't seen before. Recognition. And fear. Talyra stepped forward cautiously, her violet eyes scanning the towering structure before them. It was ancient, older than any civilization Eric had ever seen. The walls were carved with intricate patterns, symbols that pulsed faintly with a light of their own, as though something within still lived. Eric swallowed hard. You recognize this place? Talyra nodded, her grip tightening on her weapon. This is a temple of the first ones. Eric frowned. The first ones? Talyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. The precursors. The ones who came before my kind, before yours. They ruled the stars long before our wars began. And then, they vanished. Eric exhaled slowly. You think they left something behind? Talyra didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her hand against one of the glowing symbols. The stone shifted beneath her touch, grinding with age, and a deep hum resonated through the cavern. Then, the doors opened. A gust of cold air rushed out from the darkness within. The scent was wrong. Old, but not like dust. More like something that had been preserved for too long. Eric tightened his grip on his rifle. I have a bad feeling about this. Talyra stepped inside. The interior of the temple was massive, stretching into a darkness that their flashlights barely pierced. The walls were covered in more symbols, but now, Eric noticed something else. Skeletons. Dozens of them, slumped against the walls, their forms twisted in unnatural ways. Some were Kethari, others weren't. Eric's throat went dry. They didn't die in battle. Talyra crouched beside one of the remains, running her fingers over the brittle bones. No, they died running from something. The deep hum in the walls grew louder. The symbols flared brighter, shifting, as though responding to their presence. Then, Eric heard it, faint at first, but undeniable. A whisper, not in any language he knew, but it sent a chill through his spine all the same. Talyra's head snapped up. She heard it too. Then, something moved in the darkness. A deep, resonant growl echoed through the chamber. Eric swung his rifle around, scanning the shadows. The air seemed to vibrate as the ancient stone shifted once more. Then, it emerged. A figure, tall, far taller than even the Carthari. Its body was wrapped in dark metallic plating, its face obscured by an angular helmet that pulsed with the same eerie glow as the walls. It did not walk. It glided, silent, graceful, its presence more felt than seen. Talyra stiffened. Impossible. Eric gritted his teeth. You know what that is? She barely nodded. A guardian of the first ones. They were supposed to be myths. The guardian tilted its head toward them, and then it spoke. Its voice was a layered echo, as if many beings spoke at once. You are not welcome. Eric barely had time to react before it moved. The guardian lunged, faster than anything that size had any right to be. Talyra barely dodged as its arm, if it could be called that, swung in a blur, striking the stone where she had stood moments before. The impact cracked the ground. Eric fired instinctively. The plasma bolt hit the guardian's chest. It did nothing. The guardian turned toward him. Its helmet flared with symbols, warning signs, he realized too late. Then, a shockwave blasted outward. Eric was thrown back, crashing against the temple wall. His vision blurred. His ears rang. He tasted blood. Talyra was already moving, her blades flashing as she tried to cut through the guardian's armor. Sparks flew, but the strikes barely left a mark. "Eric, move!" she shouted. Eric forced himself to his feet, every muscle protesting. His rifle was gone, but his Kethari blade was still strapped to his side. He drew it, gripping it tight. Talyra dodged another swing, flipping over the guardian's arm. "We can't fight this thing head-on." Eric's mind raced. The guardian was ancient, powerful, but it was still a machine, wasn't it? His eyes flicked to the glowing symbols on the walls. The same light pulsed in the guardian's helmet. Talyra, the symbols. She understood instantly. While Eric ran to the walls, she leapt high, drawing the guardian's attention. It followed her, its energy flaring brighter. Eric reached the nearest set of glowing glyphs. Without thinking, he pressed his palm against one. The temple shuddered. The lights flickered. And for the first time, the guardian hesitated. Talyra landed beside him. "Whatever you did, do it again." Eric pressed another glyph. Then another. The guardian let out an inhuman roar. Its body convulsed as the light in its helmet flashed wildly. Then, it collapsed. Silence. Eric and Talyra stood there, breathless, waiting. The guardian didn't move. Eric exhaled, wiping blood from his mouth. "Please tell me that thing isn't getting back up." Talyra didn't answer. She was staring at something behind him. Eric turned. The temple was changing. The symbols along the walls were formed into something new, something clearer. The whispers returned, but this time, Eric understood them. A warning. You have awakened the first ones. And far beneath them, in the depths of the planet, something stirred. The ground trembled, not from the guardian's collapse, but from something deeper, something rising. Eric's pulse pounded as he turned to Talyra. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." She didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the shifting symbols, reading them with an intensity he had never seen before. The pulsing lights along the walls were no longer random. They were forming patterns, a sequence, a message. Then she whispered something in her own tongue. A curse, maybe. Eric clenched his fists. "Talyra?" Her voice was low, almost reverent. This was not just a temple, it was a vault. A cold knot formed in Eric's stomach. A vault for what? Talyra turned to him, and for the first time since they met, there was something in her expression he had never seen before. Fear. "The first ones," she said. "They never vanished. They were sealed away." The floor beneath them cracked. A deep, guttural sound. Something old, something alien, rumbled from below. And then, the vault doors began to open. A massive stone slab slid apart, releasing a wave of icy air that sent a shiver through Eric's body. The cavern shuddered as the opening widened, revealing a chasm of pure blackness. And then they saw it, a shape emerging from the depths. It was nothing like the Guardian. Where the Guardian had been mechanical, this was something else. It was biological, its form twisted and shifting, as though reality itself struggled to contain it. Limbs coiled and uncoiled, faces flickered in and out of existence, its skin shimmering between solid and translucent. And worst of all, Eric could feel it. Not just see it, feel it. In his mind, in his bones. A voice, not spoken but projected straight into his thoughts, echoed through the chamber. "We have waited long enough." Eric staggered back, clutching his head. The sheer force of the words made his skull feel like it would split apart. Talyra dropped to one knee, gripping her blade, her expression twisted in pain. The entity rose higher, its form still shifting, still unfathomable. "You are unworthy." And then it moved. The thing lashed out, not with limbs, but with force, an invisible wave of pressure that shattered the cavern walls. Eric dove, barely avoiding being crushed by falling debris. He grabbed Talyra, pulling her to her feet as the temple around them began to collapse. "We need to get the hell out of here," he shouted. Talyra's eyes were unfocused, her mind still reeling from the entity's presence. But she nodded. Together, they ran. The passage they had come through was already caving in. Eric dodged falling rocks, his lungs burning as dust choked the air. Behind them, the first one continued to rise, its massive form distorting the space around it. Eric risked a glance back, and immediately wished he hadn't. The thing wasn't just rising. It was growing, expanding, consuming the space it touched, and it was following them. Talyra, move. She didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted through the collapsing temple, the hum of ancient energy now replaced by the deafening roar of destruction. The entrance was close, just a few more meters. Then, the first one spoke again. "You cannot flee from the inevitable." And suddenly, reality itself twisted. Eric's vision blurred as the temple warped around him. The walls stretched, bent, melted into something else. The exit that had been just ahead of them was suddenly impossibly far away. "No, no, no," Eric growled, forcing himself to keep moving. Talyra reached out, grabbing his arm. "We must break its hold." Eric's mind raced. The entity was warping space, manipulating perception. It wasn't just keeping them trapped, it was pulling them in. His eyes darted to the Guardian's lifeless body. The glyphs that had controlled it still glowed faintly. An idea formed. A desperate, reckless idea. "Talyra, cover me." Without waiting for a response, Eric sprinted toward the Guardian's remains. Eric slid to a stop beside the fallen Guardian, his fingers flying over the glowing symbols on its armor. They reacted to his touch, pulsing weakly. He didn't understand Ketheri technology. Hell, he barely understood human tech half the time. But he knew one thing. This thing was designed to stop the first ones. Talyra deflected a wave of force with her blades, gritting her teeth as she shielded Eric from the entity's growing influence. "Hurry!" Eric pressed another sequence of symbols. The Guardian's body jolted. Energy surged through its form, flickering like a dying flame. Then, the helmet flared back to life. The Guardian stood. The first one reacted instantly. The shifting mass of its form trembled, and a sound, a scream, echoed through the cavern. The Guardian's head snapped toward the entity. Its ancient voice boomed, no longer fractured. Access restored. Executing containment protocol. A brilliant surge of energy erupted from the Guardian's body. The first one convulsed, its form distorting wildly as the blast struck it. The walls rippled. The ground trembled. The entity recoiled, shrieking, not in pain, but in rage. The Guardian took a step forward. "Return to your slumber." The first one fought back. Dark tendrils lashed out, wrapping around the Guardian, trying to crush it. But the ancient machine did not waver. It pressed forward, the energy pulsing from its body growing stronger. Eric grabbed Talyra's arm. "Now's our chance." They ran, the cavern distorting around them as the battle raged behind them. The entrance was there. For real, this time. They dove through just as the temple collapsed completely. Eric lay on his back, staring up at the twin suns as dust settled around them. His lungs burned. His head pounded. but he was alive. Beside him, Talyra groaned, pushing herself up. She looked back at the ruins of the temple, watching as the ground caved inward, sealing whatever was left beneath tons of rock. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eric exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. That was the worst escape plan I've ever come up with. Talyra turned to him, arching a brow. And yet, we survived. Eric sat up, glancing at the ruins. You think it's really gone? Talyra didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on the wreckage, her expression troubled. Then, quietly, she said, "No." Eric's stomach twisted. Talyra stood, brushing dust from her armor. That was just one. There are more. Eric ran a hand through his sweat-matted hair. Of course there are. The war they had been fighting against the Carthari no longer seemed so important. A new war was coming, and this time, it wasn't just for survival. The wind howled across the ruins, carrying the last whispers of the collapsed temple into the endless wasteland. Dust settled in the canyon, but Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the surface still breathed. Talyra stood motionless, her violet eyes scanning the rubble. Her expression was unreadable, but Eric had learned to recognize the way her muscles tensed, the slight tilt of her head when she was lost in thought. She was still listening, still waiting. Eric exhaled and rubbed a hand down his face. His body ached from the battle, from the running, from the sheer wrongness of what they had just encountered. The first ones weren't dead. They had never been dead. They had been imprisoned. And now, he glanced at the rubble. Now one had almost gotten out. "Say something," he muttered, breaking the heavy silence between them. Talyra blinked, then turned to him. "It will not hold forever." Eric let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, figured that much." He shook his head, staring at the darkening horizon. "So what the hell do we do now?" Talyra hesitated. "We find answers." Eric scoffed. "Great. Love a good research mission right after almost getting erased from existence." She didn't react to his sarcasm. Instead, she knelt, drawing a symbol in the dust with the tip of her blade. A series of interwoven circles, almost identical to the ones in the temple. "This was no accident, human," she said. "The Carthari warband was driving us toward this place. Someone wanted this vault found." Eric frowned, crouching beside her. "You think the Carthari knew what was down there?" Talyra shook her head. "No. If they had, they would not have come so carelessly. But someone, something, orchestrated this." Eric ran a hand through his sweat-matted hair. He hated how much sense that made. He hated it even more because it meant the worst wasn't behind them. Not even close. As the suns dipped lower in the sky, Eric and Talyra made their way back into the canyons, keeping to the shadows. The Carthari warband was still out there. If they had realized their scouts were missing, they'd be hunting. But Eric wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the voice that had spoken in his mind. The presence of the first one. Even now, it lingered at the edges of his thoughts like an echo. A warning, a threat, and something else. As they moved through the narrow rock passage, he finally said it out loud. "Talyra, when the first one spoke to us, did you hear what I heard?" She glanced at him. "You mean it's hatred?" Eric shook his head. "No, the other part. The part where it said, 'We are unworthy.'" Talyra slowed her pace. Her brows furrowed in thought. Eric pressed on. "That thing didn't just wake up angry. It woke up disappointed, like it expected something else." Talyra was silent for a long time. Then, finally, she murmured, "Not something else." She stopped walking, and when she turned to face him, her expression was grim. "Someone else?" Eric felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You're saying they weren't just sealed away?" His throat went dry. They were waiting for someone to wake them up. Talyra's jaw tightened. "And that someone is still out there." The weight of those words pressed down on them both. They weren't just dealing with an ancient nightmare. They were dealing with whoever was trying to let it out. They didn't get a chance to process it. A sharp, inhuman screech cut through the air. Eric's instinct screamed before his brain caught up. He spun, rifle raised, but the attack came too fast. A dark shape barreled out of the shadows, knocking him to the ground. A Carthari warrior. Eric grunted, wrestling against the alien strength. The Carthari had 4 arms, but one of them was missing, a fresh wound still leaking dark ichor. A survivor from the warband? It roared in his face, mandibles snapping. Eric barely managed to wedge his blade between them before they closed on his throat. Then a flash of silver, Talyra. Her blade sliced through the Carthari's back in a single, elegant motion. The warrior spasmed, then fell still. Eric shoved the corpse off him, gasping for breath. Yeah, that's enough surprises for one day. Talyra's eyes, however, were still on the shadows. Her body was tense, listening, watching. Eric followed her gaze. The silence was heavy, too heavy. Then he saw it. Glowing eyes in the dark. Not one pair. Dozens. The Carthari warband had found them. Eric's mind screamed run, but his body knew better. There was nowhere to go. The warband had them surrounded. Talyra didn't hesitate. She raised her twin blades, stepping into a battle stance. Eric gritted his teeth. He lifted his rifle, rolling his shoulders. Guess we're doing this. The Carthari warriors stepped forward, their chitinous armor glinting in the faint twilight. But they didn't attack. Not yet. One of them, a massive Carthari, even by their standards, stepped ahead of the others. Its voice was a guttural growl. You are the ones who entered the vault. Eric felt ice settle in his gut. So they did know. Talyra remained silent, calculating. The massive Carthari tilted its head, studying them. Tell me, human, did you see it? Eric's fingers twitched on his rifle. See what? The warrior let out a deep, guttural chuckle. The end of all things. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the warrior's mandibles spread wide in something that might have been a grin. Your survival proves that you are worthy. Eric glanced at Talyra, but she looked just as confused as he felt. The Carthari leader took another step forward. The vault was only the beginning. Eric's blood turned cold. There are more, the Carthari said, and soon they will all awaken. The words hung in the air like the final echoes of a gunshot. They will all awaken. Eric's fingers tensed on his rifle, his mind racing through the implications. One was bad enough. If there were more, he swallowed hard. You expect us to just take your word for it? The Carthari leader tilted its head, eyes gleaming with something Eric couldn't quite place. Amusement? Pity? You have already seen the truth. Denial is pointless. Talyra took a step forward, her blade still raised. What do you want? The Carthari let out a deep, guttural sound, something between a growl and a sigh. We have fought for generations, spilled blood across 1,000 worlds. But this war, the war between our kinds, was always a distraction. Eric felt the hairs on his arms rise. A distraction from what? The Carthari warrior took another step forward. From them. A shiver ran through Eric's spine. The first ones did not die. They were never conquered, the warrior continued. They were sealed away by those who came after them, lesser beings desperate to survive. But time has undone those efforts. The locks are breaking, and soon. He paused, his mandibles clicking softly. You will understand why our war was meaningless. Talyra's grip tightened on her weapons. And you think we should fight together? The Carthari warrior let out a cold laugh. Fight? No. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You cannot fight what is coming. You can only choose how you die. Eric's stomach twisted. He had seen enough horror in his years of war, but this was different. The Carthari were afraid. That alone terrified him more than any enemy he'd ever faced. Talyra, however, didn't flinch. Then why are you here? The Carthari was silent for a long moment. Then he said, to offer you a choice. Eric frowned. What kind of choice? The Carthari's mandibles curled into something that might have been a smile. Come with us, he said, or be the first to fall when the gods return. Silence. Eric stole a glance at Talyra, trying to gauge her reaction. Her expression was unreadable, but he could see the gears turning in her mind. The Carthari leader continued. The war between our species is nothing compared to what is coming. My people, we have known this for longer than yours. And we have been preparing. Preparing how? Eric asked. The warrior's mandibles twitched in amusement. You think you are the first to open a vault? He gestured toward the ruins behind them. No, there were others. On other worlds. Some still sealed. Some already breached. Eric felt his chest tighten. You mean? He licked his lips. You mean the first ones have already escaped somewhere else? The Carthari leader nodded. Not all. Not yet. But enough. Talyra finally spoke. Then why are we still here? Why isn't the galaxy burning? The Carthari warrior exhaled, his mandibles clicking. Because they are not ready yet. Their power grows with each awakening, but they still slumber, waiting for the right conditions. Waiting for whoever is guiding them to release them fully. Eric clenched his fists. That confirmed it. Someone, something, was deliberately waking these nightmares up. Talyra narrowed her eyes. And you think you can stop them? The Carthari warrior let out a sound like gravel grinding together. No, but we can survive them. Eric shook his head. So let me get this straight. You're asking us to come with you, but not to fight the first ones. Just to what? Hide. The Carthari warrior's gaze darkened. Survival is not the same as hiding. There are things we have learned. Weapons, secrets buried in the ruins of ancient battles. If there is a way to contain the first ones again, it lies within the knowledge we have gathered. Talyra glanced at Eric. He could tell what she was thinking. Do we trust them? Eric exhaled. And what if we refuse? The Carthari leader tilted his head. Then when the gods awaken, you will be nothing but dust beneath their feet. Eric sat on the edge of a jagged rock, staring at the endless wasteland ahead. The twin suns had almost fully set now, casting the planet in eerie twilight. Talyra stood beside him, arms crossed. The Carthari warriors remained at a distance, watching but making no further moves. You believe them? Eric asked finally. Talyra was quiet for a moment. Then, I believe they believe it. Eric ran a hand through his hair. Yeah, that's what scares me. He had spent the last few years of his life fighting these bastards, watching them butcher human colonies, ambush supply convoys, slaughter civilians without hesitation. And now, suddenly, they wanted an alliance? Talyra sat beside him. You have seen what I have, human. You know this war is over. Even if we kill every Carthari in this system, it will not matter. Eric sighed, rubbing his temples. Yeah, doesn't mean I have to like it. Talyra smirked slightly. No, but it means you have to decide. Eric looked at her, then at the Carthari waiting in the distance. His gut told him this was insane, but his gut also told him they weren't lying. If there was even a chance that they were right, that the galaxy was about to face something far worse than this war. He made his decision. He stood, gripping his rifle. Talyra rose beside him. They turned toward the Carthari leader, and Eric said the words that would change everything. Fine, we're in. The Carthari warrior's mandibles spread wide, his gleaming eyes reflecting the stars above. Then let me show you the truth. The Carthari led them deep into the canyon, away from the ruins of the vault. They walked for miles, through jagged ravines and shadowed corridors of stone. Finally, they reached their destination, a hidden outpost built into the rock. And when Eric stepped inside, he felt his breath catch in his throat. The chamber was massive, lined with alien technology humming with energy. But what stunned him most was what hung at the center of the room. A holographic map of the galaxy. And on that map, dozens of red markers pulsed faintly. Eric's blood ran cold. These are the vaults? He asked quietly. The Carthari leader nodded. The ones we have confirmed. The ones we know are breaking open. Eric swallowed hard. There were too many to stop. Talyra stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. How long do we have? The Carthari warrior exhaled. Some remain sealed, but others. He reached out, touching one of the glowing red dots. It flared in response. This one is already lost. Eric's jaw clenched. Where is it? The Carthari's eyes met his, and then, in a voice like the tolling of a funeral bell, he answered, Earth. Silence fell over the chamber, heavy as a tomb. Eric stared at the pulsating red marker on the galactic map. Earth. His home. His past. The place he had fought for, bled for. Gone? No, not yet. He turned to the Carthari leader, his voice tight. What do you mean, lost? The warrior tilted his head. We lost contact with our spies near your world days ago. The vault there has already been breached. We do not know the extent of the awakening. Eric clenched his fists. His breath came shallow, rage and fear battling in his chest. His entire life, the war had been simple, us versus them. Humanity against the Carthari. Now, that war meant nothing. Now, the real war was beginning. Talyra stepped closer, her violet eyes locked on the glowing map. If Earth is compromised, then we need to get there. Now. The Carthari leader exhaled, a low, gravelly sound. Foolish. You would arrive too late. The first ones do not conquer. They consume. If they have begun their work, your world is already changing. Eric shoved him back, his teeth bared. Then we stop them. The Carthari warrior did not react, only watching him with that same cold, unreadable gaze. And how do you propose to do that, human? Eric's mind raced. The guardian they had encountered had been powerful, but it had fallen. There had to be something, anything, that could fight these things on their level. His eyes flicked to the holographic map again. You said some vaults are still sealed. The Carthari nodded slowly. Yes. Eric jabbed a finger at the glowing display. Then we open them first. Talyra's eyes widened slightly, realization dawning. You want to find their weapons? Eric nodded. The first ones ruled the galaxy once, but something sealed them away. Someone fought them and won. There has to be a way to do it again. The Carthari let out a chittering sound, half amusement, half something darker. You propose to fight the gods with the weapons of ghosts. Eric shrugged. Got a better idea? For the first time, the Carthari hesitated. Talyra turned to Eric. If we do this, we are no longer just warriors. We are the only thing standing between the void and the rest of the galaxy. Eric smirked, despite the weight pressing on his chest. No pressure, right? She held his gaze, then offered a rare, small smile. No pressure. The Carthari warrior exhaled, his mandibles twitching. Then, with something that might have been reluctant respect, he said, then we begin. The journey back to their stolen ship was tense. Eric and Talyra stayed close, their weapons drawn, while the Carthari warband marched in eerie silence. The air was thick with tension. Eric didn't trust them. Not completely. Maybe never. But right now, they were the only ones who knew what was coming. By the time they reached orbit, the reality of what they were doing had fully set in. They were leaving Gorith, 7 behind. The war between humanity and the Carthari, the bloodshed, the battlefields, it was all meaningless now. The true enemy had awakened. Eric sat in the co-pilot seat, staring at the star map flickering before him. Red markers blinked across the screen, each one a time bomb waiting to go off. Talyra leaned over the console, tapping in coordinates. There. A single vault. Still sealed. Its location deep in uncharted space. Eric exhaled. And you really think whatever's in there is going to help us? Talyra met his gaze, her expression deadly serious. It has to. Eric sat back, gripping the controls. Outside, the stars stretched into infinity. They were heading toward something ancient, something dangerous. But if they didn't, Earth was next. He punched in the final command. The ship rumbled, engines firing, breaking free of the planet's gravity. As the ship vanished into the void, Eric took one last look at Gorith, 7. The war had ended, but the real war had only just begun.